All right, here we go. This is NSCA Essentials of Personal Training, Chapter 20. We're now moving into the conversation of clients with cardiovascular or respiratory conditions. And again, a lot like some of the other conditions we've already talked about, clients who have the conditions that we're going to go over will already know they have them and probably have to find ways to manage or find workarounds for their conditions. So with that stated, I'm not saying you need to be dismissive. What I need you to understand is that you have people who are coming in, they're seeking you out for like your expertise and skill and being able to implement programming within the context of perhaps some limitations that they may have. But again, these are individuals who already know that they have these conditions. Rare will be the case they walk in, they have no idea that they have COPD or something else. So let's go ahead and jump in. When we look at this in the front end of the book, or front end here on page 548, 549, you have to understand some of the risk factors that tie into uh, hypertension, MI. I'll say MI more than myocardial infarction, just so you know. Some type of cerebral vascular accident, meaning a stroke of some variety, peripheral vascular disease, asthma, COPD, exercise-induced bronchoconstriction or bronchitis. And, how these things will affect a person in a workout. And there are certain times when you may have to actually source out a medical professional. All right, so with essential hypertension or hypertension um, that has no known cause, or at least in our parlance is referred to as idiopathic, um, that's about 95% of the people that will have hypertension, meaning some type of high blood pressure. And usually exercise is one of the first lines of defense to help with hypertension. And then you'll have a medical intervention of some variety that's pharmacological, where the doctor will prescribe some type of medication to help with hypertension. Oftentimes, this is referred to as a silent killer because you just don't see it in people. There may be some tells, maybe perhaps they'll get a little winded. They get like very red in the face or rosy in the cheeks when they work out a little more than some of your other clients. But those are not definitive. You can't really lean into those and say that person has hypertension. You'll have to have a conversation with the person perhaps about going to their doctor. But there are a number of factors that we can't control. Diet, type of lifestyle, for example. Are they working out? Are they sedentary? And what type of stress environment are they in? So to a certain degree, when we talk about, secondary factors, which is the 5%, we can control even some of the lifestyle things that we're talking about with the 95% who have hypertension without any known cause. But there's a point in time where the hypertension itself becomes almost um, uncontrollable. And I mean, I have some clients of mine who they have some challenges in terms of their hypertension, and they can't control it even with medication. We have to do normal courses of medication, and then they also need what's called BID, meaning kind of on-demand medication when they have a hypertensive episode, meaning they're like 200 over 100 or 220 over 120. I mean, they're elevated for sure. And sometimes, at least where I work, we have to send people to the hospital as a result when it becomes non-controllable. So when you look at this in terms of what they note here in the book, although hypertension is highly prevalent, a large portion of individuals may not display any signs or symptoms of the disorder until a cardiac event occurs. So, to a certain degree, when you work with your people, it becomes a conversation of them knowing their blood pressure, maybe perhaps you even taking their blood pressure and you find it's elevated. They may have had a doctor's visit and they found they had elevated blood pressure. So it's a matter of that the client have an understanding of their blood pressure and blood pressure concerns. Now, when we look at blood pressure itself, normal would be less than 120 over less than 80. So 120 over 80 is kind of like your cut-in threshold there, where that would be considered normal for anything below, for both of those, anything below. It becomes elevated when you have over 120 to 129, you can see over here, and less than 80. When you get down to hypertension stage 2, it becomes 130 to 139 so it's an either or at this point, 80 over 90. So when you see some case studies, you have to understand that you can have an elevated blood pressure that's 120 over 129, and then they're under 80. meaning it doesn't become an either or scenario until you have the diastolic blood pressure go over 80. Now think back to the mechanisms of the heart. Systolic, squish; diastolic, relax. So you know, like when a person is working out and we increase workloads, you have squish, the pressure is going to go up. That's this number represented here. When they're relaxing, that's the amount of pressure that's on the system or on the walls of the system when they're at rest, in between heartbeats. And so it's a matter of knowing that when we're working with, when we're seeing people at rest, when their heart contracts, squish, and the systolic blood pressure reads at 129, even though they might be below 80, we know that there is an elevated category here that's referred to as elevated for when the blood pressure is elevated on the systolic side. Now, systolic and diastolic becomes either or, like I mentioned here and here, and stage 2 hypertension is greater than 140 or greater than 90. And to a certain degree, that's the point where we start sending people off to the hospital. So with blood pressure itself, they talk about management of hypertension, they talk about exercise, weight loss, and nutritional changes, and they talk about dietary approaches to stop hypertension, which is the DASH diet. And there's some good stuff here. You know, we start to read through this, it kind of makes sense. Reducing saturated fats, reducing cholesterol, reducing total fat intake. Gets back to our conversation before when we were talking about different types of fats, and you have the low density and very low density lipoproteins and how they carry cholesterol through the bloodstream, and how the low density lipoproteins are the ones that dump the cholesterol off into the bloodstream, and actually that's the plaque that sticks to the inside of the vascular system, which helps increase blood pressure. So they talk about emphasis is more on fruits, vegetables, low-fat dairy products, whole grain products, fish, poultry, and nuts. Reduction in red meat, sweets, and sugar-containing beverages. You know, all these things make sense. They go into a little bit more in terms of like increasing foods rich in magnesium, potassium, calcium, protein, and fiber. Got it. With medications, when a client comes in and they mention they're on a beta blocker, that's this right here, that kind of B looking scripted B, that's a beta blocker. They might be a calcium channel blocker. ACE2 inhibitor is another one that you'll often hear. Those are usually the medications. You hear those right away and you go, are you hypertensive? Because you just know when you hear that classification of medication, they're used specifically for blood pressure. And your clients oftentimes will be very familiar if they're on a beta blocker or on any of the so I'm gonna go back to that one. If they're on any kind of beta blocker or calcium channel blocker, like an ACE, or they have an ACE2 inhibitor, you know, they'll know that and they know how their body responds to those medications. But still, you know, when you first start working with somebody and get to know them, you'll have to take a little bit of time to make sure they're doing okay in their workouts, and they can understand what their actual workloads are and what their limitations are while doing different exercise. What they notice here is lower blood pressure. You know, diuretics cause blood volume depletion. However, the personal trainer should never restrict clients' use of fluids. I agree. And then when you get further down here, calcium channel blockers or A blockers, alpha blockers, and beta blockers cause vasodilation, meaning an increase or an expansion of the vascular system. And when you have a person working out, that's why it's important to have them kind of, if you will, not in a scared manner, but a cautious manner, stair-step their way into their workout program to have an understanding of just what they can tolerate in terms of workload and what they cannot. They know the medications can cause blood pooling, which necessitates longer period for cool down, especially after a treadmill. So what they talk about is this: beta blockers not only slow the heart rate, but also prevent it from elevating as a normal response to exercise, which I agree with that. And I have my own experience. I've seen that with a client where I had one gentleman, no matter how hard I worked him, it was like 105 was his limit. That was his ceiling. And, you know, we had to basically use how you feeling, what's your RPE, et cetera, to really get an idea of workload, because I just couldn't push him beyond that 105 to 110 range. That was it. So when you talk about clients with hypertension, when you get to 220 on systolic and 105 on diastolic, you're stopping exercise. There's no pulse of a mover. We're not holding our breath at all. And they also know the book also notes the comorbidities where exercise should be restricted or altered. But they note here, I just want to point this out, this is something you'll see later on, with the systolic blood pressure of 220 and a diastolic of 105 is considered grounds for exercise termination. With the Valsalva maneuver, that's where you're holding your breath for 2 seconds. You don't want to do that. And then they talk about these main conditions over here to the right. So these comorbidity conditions include musculoskeletal conditions or diseases, degenerative joint diseases, rheumatoid, basically rheumatoid arthritis or rheumatologic diseases, neurological disorders, stroke. You have vascular diseases like carotid artery disease, cardiac conditions, or aneurysms. Those are the things that are kind of very much, if a person has hypertension and they have any of these, you need to kind of tread with some caution and make sure that they have clearance from a doctor to be able to do their workup. All right, I'm going to jump into the next presentation. I'll be right back.